So just before I finish my presentation, I'll just run through a little bit of statistical information which will show you, first of all, the supply of services. And if you see here, this is just roughly the year 2000. So this was a liberalisation of the market. So down here was where the taxis were. So obviously the hackneys here were bridging the gap while the taxis were low. Obviously then, as the market overnight was liberalised, huge increase in the taxis, decrease in the hackneys. And then the Taxi Commission was established. We decided to introduce the reform package. Things still moved on up, and really only from 2008 did the equilibrium happen. And we're now seeing a trend where the numbers are now settling and the numbers have reduced slightly. So when the market was liberalised, there was many, many hackneys. Now you can see from this chart here that the dominant feature in the industry in Ireland is now taxis. So we've got 74% of the whole of the fleet that are now taxis. In terms of drivers, we have quite a large number of drivers. We've about 26,000 vehicles, but we had up to, in March 2010, probably February 2010, about 47,000 drivers. Not all of our drivers operate. Anybody can apply for a small public service vehicle driver licence, but they may not necessarily operate in the industry. And many people keep that licence in the back pocket, as it were, in case they may need it for the future. So when we introduced the skills development programme, it was interesting to see that there was a drop in drivers renewing their licences. So it's indicative of the fact that not all drivers who have a licence operate in the industry. And then vehicle licences, just wanted to give you another look at 2000 to 2010, where you can see again, there at liberalisation, okay, that's the total taxis, hackneys and limousines. 4,000 of those were taxis, but the rest were hackneys. And then again, you can see the move up over time, and then the peak was in 2008, and then it's kind of settling down and moving backwards since in 2010. So a small exit from the industry already, and we expect probably to see, as we put more quality standards in place, there probably will be a further exit from the industry, which will settle the numbers overall. This graph here just shows you, again, from January 2008 up there to March 2008, it was still quite a high level of people coming in looking for taxi licences. But then, as a result of education and I suppose telephoning our industry line, we would advise people, don't make a casual decision to come into the industry. Look at the competition that's out there, high competitive market, think about it before you come in. People did start to think about it before they came in, and as a result, you can see right down here to 2010, we've got little or nobody coming into the industry. And then just quickly, some compliance statistics since we took over complaints. We had 601 complaints in 2008, 476 in 2009, and 244 already in 2010. So again, complaints are reducing. People are more aware of what the requirements are. Consumers are more satisfied with the service. The quality standards are starting to take place, and therefore the complaints are reducing. And as you can see then, our statistics there for fixed charge penalties and also for prosecutions. And finally, I'll just show you our industry and consumer lines. And you can see the difference there in the amount of industry that telephone us and the amount of consumers that telephone us. We've got quite a large amount of interaction with the industry. So I suppose what we do is we write to the industry on a regular basis, and we also issue newsletters on a regular basis. And again, some of the newsletters are out there on the display table outside. When we issue a newsletter, which we do quarterly, what that does is we immediately get a number of interesting calls from the industry relative to looking to get further information about reforms that we might be going to introduce, but we also get many complaints about the reform packages as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have time for a few questions. Anybody? Yes.
A Hackney is a pre-booked service, so it's a private hire vehicle. So what happens with a Hackney is you book it in advance and you agree the fare in advance. There's no taximeter in the Hackney. So the fare is agreed in advance of the hire between the driver and the passenger. It's not, no, it's a standard vehicle, standard car.
Okay.
Hi, I had the opportunity to visit Ireland a couple of years ago, and I had an opportunity to see an awful lot of taxi cabs on cab stands in Galway and in Dublin. I look at the deregulation, I look at the number of taxi cabs from 4,000 to just under 20,000 now. I saw in your slides that the industry impact has been driver revenues down, longer hours by the drivers, taxi companies competing for fewer customers by offering discounts, and in the last year or so I'm seeing a large number of operators leaving the industry. I'm wondering how you can draw success from that program if the industry has been that negatively impacted.
Yeah, I suppose the answer to that is the horse had bolted before the Commission was established. So I suppose we were left with a situation where the market was deregulated by government, and I suppose the perfect solution at that point in time was that the quality standards should have been introduced at a much, much earlier stage, whereas we're now faced with the challenge of trying to introduce quality standards after the horse had bolted. In other words, when the significant numbers increased. Having said that, there were a huge amount of drivers who benefited from deregulation in that a number of extra people came into the system and therefore gave opportunities for drivers in terms of employment and in terms of operating from a self-employed perspective. So all of those drivers are there together now, and what we want to try and do in the future is to work with them and raise the quality standards. Yes, there will be some people who will leave the industry in the future.
What were the primary factors that affected the shortage of cabs prior to deregulation? Was it the fact that the fare structures were too low, or were the regulatory authorities in place at the time artificially setting the number of cabs too low? Or was it something else?
I'm not sure exactly because I wasn't involved with the industry at the time, but it would appear for me, I would have been a consumer at the time, but it certainly would appear that numbers were restricted. Local authorities managed the numbers, and how the numbers would be increased would be by lobbying of the industry to get a few more numbers. But certainly there was no overall approach looking at numbers and as to why, for instance, there was never any research done relative to demand and supply and what should be done into the future. So I think what happened was that's why the Hackney industry came in and filled that gap. There was no doubt to the consumer out there that there was a shortage of supply in terms of demand. The Hackneys then were not regulated in terms of quantity, so the Hackneys came in and took the business in the meantime to try and fill that gap.
Kathleen, I wanted to ask a quick question about the stakeholder engagement and the public consultation that you referred to. One of the hardest things to do as a regulator is to actively and in any kind of quality way get any feedback from the public, not because they're not interested, but because they just have so much else to do. The taxis never rises to the top of their list. So did you come up with any new ways of getting some meaningful feedback from the traveling public and translating that into regulatory language?
Yes, we do, Karen. I suppose one of the main things that we do is consumer research, because certainly we'll engage with the industry on a regular basis, and on a quarterly basis we will meet all the various stakeholders from the industry perspective. But to get that feedback from the consumers, we meet also the consumer associations who represent consumers for their feedback as to what we should do moving forward. And also we engage with consumers with a number of research models. And we, in fact, we'd one very, very interesting consumer survey carried out this year as part of our fare structure, because whilst you'll ask consumers what they think, they need to be educated as well, particularly in terms of the costs of operating in the industry, because what we didn't want this year for the fare structure was all of consumers just saying what we would expect consumers to say, which is put the fare down. So therefore you've got to engage with consumers to ensure that they realise what it costs for the industry to operate. So we engage with consumers through surveys and also through consumer groups as well.
I'm Cesar Padilla, Tampa, Florida. The reason we have a closed market in Tampa and in Hillsborough County is mainly for the protection of the traveling public and the service that we provide to them. Okay, how can you justify that, and to prevent cannibalism from among the industry? So how can you justify that the service is going to be better by having an open market and from having so a small number of taxis, now you have a flourished. How is the service being maintained by the taxi industry to protect the consumer?
I suppose the answer really is it's the introduction of the quality standards that we're trying to do in terms of vehicle standards. So what we want to try and do in Ireland is have people investing in the vehicle as distinct from investing in the licence. So in the open market, the licence doesn't have a value. So therefore what we're trying to do is get the industry to invest in the vehicle. So we'll have that high quality vehicle out there for the consumer, and then that will increase then consumer demand and use of the services.
I want to thank you for coming across the Atlantic to meet with us and for joining our board of directors. Thank you.